One of our very astute writers recently made the comment that freedom of speech is the most important freedom because it's the freedom by which we defend all of our other freedoms. It strikes me that freedom of speech, though, is most important not for the powerful or for the elites. It's actually for the minority groups. A free society surely is one that allows those who swim against the tide and have a different perspective the right to do so without fear of mob or state sanction.
Well,
You've had some personal experience.
Sure. I gave a talk at the University of British Columbia about a year ago. It was called A Left-Wing Case for Freedom of Speech. It's like it's really easy to make a left-wing case for freedom of speech. It's like, well, that's how the dispossessed have the opportunity to make their suffering known, right? Yeah, clearly. I mean, it's the fact that that argument even has to be made shows you how pathological the radical left has become. Because it's clearly the case that freedom of speech is not generally in the interests of the power elite, right? Because they already have access to what they need to maintain their grip on the world, let's say, if you look at things in that manner. It's the people at the bottom of the hierarchy whose right to expression needs to be protected.
Yeah. If you're in control of the debate, you don't need freedom of speech.
Oh, right, obviously. So it's always useful for the dispossessed, a freedom of speech issue. And then the other issue that you rose, that the writer that you described brought to the forefront is the idea of the hierarchy of rights. Now, in our conception of rights in Canada, we're not willing to assume that any right has priority over any other right. Now, that doesn't work out because when the two rights come into conflict with one another, which they do, you have to adjudicate their relative status. And what's happened in Canada is that equality rights keep trumping everything else. And that's not good. It's actually a good reason why you shouldn't have a Bill of Rights, and we never should have had one, in my estimation. But whatever. The freedom of speech, you say, well, speech is, the right to freedom of speech is central because it's the right by which you defend all the other rights. Well, that's why the idea of logos in the West is the most sacred concept, right? So Christ, think about this psychologically, Christ is the ideal of perfection. Now, this is independent of any religious discussion or any historical accuracy. It doesn't matter. We're looking at this from the perspective of the analysis of a myth or a story. What Christ represents is the perfect individual, whatever that is. Now, you can discuss endlessly what that is. But one of the things the West has settled on is the idea, that the perfect individual utters the truthful speech that makes potential into habitable order. Does that through truth. And that's embedded in the first few sentences in Genesis, for example, when God brings the world into being. So, and the idea that truthful speech that brings the world into being from formless potential also characterizes each person. That's our fabrication in the image of God. That's the idea of the West. It's an unbelievably remarkable idea that perfection, individual perfection, is to be found in a relationship with spoken truth. God, that's the great idea. Well, it's out of that arises the observation that there's nothing more central to the hierarchy of rights and obligations as well, let's say, than freedom of speech. Yes, it's absolutely central. That's why Christ is the Word made flesh. The idea is that the perfect individual is the person who speaks truth, but also acts out the truth of those words. It's a proposition whose merit is virtually self-evident when you understand it in that manner. So yeah, to see assaults on freedom of speech, especially compelled speech, well, that's where I drew the line in my life. It was like, we have compelled speech legislation in Canada.
Perhaps that's why the left is so determined in this country to get Christianity out of the classroom. But tell us something of the chilling...
There's no doubt that's why they're determined. I mean, people like Derrida, he called the West phallogocentric, right? Male-dominated, logos-centric. It's like, that is the West. It's logocentric. Well, if you want to take the West down, you remove the idea of the divine word from the substructure of the society. So you have to do that. It's like, and this is the level at which this war is being fought. It's fundamentally a theological war.
Interesting.
People don't like to think that, but well.
In his famous Waterloo lectures, the inaugural Blaise Pascal lecture in 1978, Malcolm Muggeridge said the West was in danger of eating itself out from within. And he spoke at great length about this attempt to, about how the West was abandoning Christianity and it had become a very empty and soulless and financially bankrupt place as a result. But it wouldn't be the end. He said, despite the attempts to kill it in places like communist China and Russia, there will always be people who will fight through to the truth. And of course, we can see now, 3 decades on, whatever, that he was absolutely right. Closer to 4 decades on, he was right.
Well, you know that Christianity is spreading faster in communist China than it did in Rome during its most rapid period of expansion in terms of proportion of people transforming. So Christianity is spreading incredibly quickly in China, which is well, who would have guessed that, right? I mean, that just makes you shake your head.
Tell us a little more about your chilling experience. I mean, Canada and Australia are culturally in many ways very alike. If it can happen in Canada, presumably it's coming here.
Oh, it's going to happen here. I think it's absolutely inevitable. It's not that big a move from where you're already at. And the fact that, well, the Qantas airline thing is a really good example. The fact that these things are happening and that corporations aren't standing up in outrage against the introduction of ideas like equity. It's like, you guys are all primed for this. Why not compelled speech? Especially if it's done for the best of all possible reasons. I was accused of denying the identities of the oppressed. It's like, well, to me, that wasn't the issue at all. The issue was, no, look, I'm not an advocate of hate speech laws for the reasons I already described. It's like, who's going to define hate? Not the people you want to define it. For sure, that's what's going to happen. That's bad enough. But then to say, well, I have to use the language of my detestable radical leftist foes, let's say, that's not happening. Yeah. So that's what I said when I made these videos.
Some of the most wonderful Australians I know are corporate leaders. And you know, they're generous, they're philanthropic, they're thoughtful, they're contributors to the public debate. But I'd have to say far too many of them seem, I'll use the expression, pig ignorant of the reality. They're playing with fire. They're playing with cultural forces that will destroy the very activities that they would hold up as being central to our wealth and prosperity.
Those cultural forces are playing with them. You know,
well, it's even worse.
Oh, yes.
So these astute people can't realise, don't see they're being toyed with.
They're being toyed with demonic forces in a sense. And again, I mean that in a psychological sense. Carl Jung said, people don't have ideas. Ideas have people. It's like, you think about that for about 5 years. You know, like if you take the typical student radical out of their demonstration and you have a chat with them one-on-one, you find out that, you know, they're the daughter of the guy down the street that you waved to, you know, while she was growing up. And that 80% of her is sensible person, you know, and 10% is resentful and 10% is ideologically possessed, partly because of the machinations of her idiot professors. And so she's okay. But if you get 10 of her together and each of them are 10% possessed, then you have the whole devil in the room, right? And that thing has a will. It has a historical will. And you better not be thinking you're running the show, especially if you're ignorant of the process. And the corporate types who are letting the radical left fifth column into their midst, and mostly through their human resources departments, which should probably just be shut down. They have no idea what they're messing with. They should watch what happens to Google.
I have to say, I've been pretty stunned by 2 or 3 of the senior chairmen in this country who've said to me or said to friends of mine in the context of recent politically correct debates here that they've been startled themselves by what their companies underneath of them have said, which raises some interesting questions about their need to get up to speed.
They're not startled enough. So I've seen, many people have sent me the sorts of training programs that the diversity consultants are foisting on the corporate world. I mean, it's as if a women's studies program has been placed in the midst of the corporate environment. It's not only the academic left, let's say, made manifest in a PowerPoint presentation. It's the worst elements of the activist academic left. The most appalling parts of the university are making themselves manifest in the corporate world at an amazing rate. And the corporations are guilty, partly because well, partly because of inequality, I would say. They're guilty and they want to wallpaper over their bad conscience with some hand waving to the equality pushers. It's like, well, play with that at your peril. So it's a very bad idea. Diversity, inclusivity, equity, that's a bad game. You're going to be burned if you play it, and in ways you can't imagine. So Google
Freedom.
already.
Freedom, fairness, respectful debate will take us
Responsibility.
a lot further.
That's right.
Responsibility.